Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the very tragic story of Robert Marr Sr. and the murder of Robert Marr Jr. that took place in North Shields in 1911. And unlike last week's story, this will be quite a short one as there is not a lot of information available, but I hope you will still find it interesting. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up. And if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. It is completely free to subscribe. It doesn't cost you any money, but it really does help to support the channel. And I would just like to add, as I always do now, that I do record these stories live, so I do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. Sadly, there is very little information about the past lives of those involved in this story, so the backstory in this case will be very basic and more based on the more recent information than the past. At the time the crime was committed, Robert Marr Sr. was said to be around 48 years old, so would have been born in around 1863. His parents are unknown. Robert was said to have been born in Dunbar in Scotland. It was not known when he had moved to the northeast, but he had been working for around 18 years as a labourer for Spencer's Steelworks in Newburn. In around 1909, he had given up his job and moved to London, where it was said he planned to set up a fish business. Now, this doesn't seem to have worked out, and in around December of 1910, he had moved back to the northeast and gone back to his job at the steelworks. No mention was ever made of him being a man who was fond of the drink. Robert Marr Jr., the victim, was said to be around 2 years old at the time of his death, so would have been born in around 1909. He was the only child of Robert Sr. and his wife, who was only ever described in the newspapers as Mrs. Marr. It seems that for most of the time the couple did not actually live together. In the early morning of June the 13th, 1911, Mrs. Marr went up to the rooms of Jane Maxwell, who lived with Mary Bruce in Hudson Street in North Shields. She then went back to her own rooms below, having left her son with James. Shortly after this, Jane heard screams coming from the room downstairs. She ran down to see what was going on. Mrs. Marr was Mary Bruce's sister, and Jane was Mrs. Marr's niece. Jane saw Robert Marr walking around the room with an axe in his hand. Mrs. Marr was able to get out of the room again, and she ran upstairs with Jane, and they locked themselves inside the room. But Robert Sr. had followed them, and he was trying to break the door down with the axe. Mrs. Marr and Jane were able to climb out of the window and escape, but they left Robert Jr. behind. Once outside, a neighbour took them in and someone went to look for a policeman. P.C. Dixon had heard the earlier screams and came to the house to see what it was about. He had seen Robert Marr with an axe in his hand and he had gone to find some help. After P.C. Spindler had been told of the man with the axe in Hudson Street, he quickly went to the house, joined by P.C.'s McGee and Tulloch. When they arrived, they found that Robert Sr. had locked himself inside. They were able to break the door down, and when they searched the house, they found Robert Jr. in the rooms upstairs. He had a large wound to his head, and there was blood all around him. He was still breathing, so they immediately sent for the doctor. Dr. Phillips arrived a short time later, and he did all that he could for Robert Jr., but sadly he died around an hour and a half later. Robert Sr. was then arrested and charged with the willful murder of his son and taken to the police station. The inquest was held at the police courts in North Shields, and although it is not made clear who had identified the body of Robert Jr., I think we can assume that his mother would have identified him. And Mrs. Marr said that Robert Sr. was her husband. She said for many years he had worked at the steelworks at Newburn. She said around 2 years ago he had gone to London, but he came back to the northeast around 7 months ago and went back to the steelworks. She said when he returned he seemed different. She said he acted strangely and was often violent. Around 3 weeks after his return, she said she had gone to visit him at Newburn and he had been very upset, and he said that he had bad pains in his head. She said she took him back to North Shields and he took some time off work, and she said at one point he had told her that he had the sound of an engine in his head and he had threatened to take his own life. But she said he seemed to recover and he went back to his job. She said around May the 16th, 1911, he had been found wandering the streets of North Shields. She said he had been arrested for theft but had not been charged, but he had been sent to the workhouse for 14 days on a charge of wandering the streets in an unsound state of mind. And after his recent release, she said she had again taken him back to North Shields. On the morning of the crime, she said she had awoken around 5 a.m. and found Robert Sr. standing at the bottom of the bed. She said she told him to go back to sleep, but she said he told her he could not exist. She said she did not take much notice of this and went back to sleep. But when she awoke again, just after 7 a.m., Robert was now standing at the bottom of the bed with an axe in his hand. She said she had quickly jumped out of bed, grabbed hold of Robert Jr. and ran to the upstairs rooms where her sister lived. She left Robert Jr. with Jane Maxwell and went back downstairs, intending to try and get the axe away from Robert Sr. When she went back into the room, Robert Sr. was standing by the door and the axe was on the mat. She said he grabbed her neck with both hands and tried to drag her towards the axe. She said she struggled and screamed, and this had made Jane come downstairs to see what was going on. Mrs. Marr said she was able to get away from her husband and that she ran back upstairs with Jane and Robert Jr. She said they locked the door, but they heard the sound of Robert Sr. trying to break in with the axe, so they tried to block the door with some boxes, but Robert Sr. was still forcing his way inside. They opened the window in the room and Jane got out of it. She said she placed Robert Jr. next to the window as she planned to pass him to Jane once she got out, but she said she fell and was hooked halfway out of the window by her clothes on a nail, and Jane had to rescue her. She said she was not able to get back up to reach her son. She said she then heard Robert Jr. screaming, and then it all went quiet. She said once she was outside, one of the neighbours took them into their house and someone went for the police. Jane Maxwell said she also lived in Hudson Street in the rooms above the Marrs. She gave almost identical evidence to Mrs. Marr, only adding that once they had climbed out of the window, she had seen her uncle come down the stairs and go back into his own room. She said he was alone at the time and did not have Robert Jr. with him. P.C. Spindler said he had been on the fish quay in North Shields when someone had come up to him and told him a man was attacking his wife and child in a house on Hudson Street. He said he immediately went to the house and was joined there by PCs McGee and Tulloch. He said on their arrival they found that Robert Sr. had locked himself in, but they were able to break the door down and get inside. He said there was a little scuffle with the man, but they were quickly able to get him under control. He said he was downstairs and at first nothing seemed wrong, but when they went up to the rooms of Mrs. Bruce, they found the small child, Robert Jr., lying on the floor in a pool of blood. He said he was still alive at the time, but it was clear that he was very badly injured, and P.C. Spindler said he immediately sent for the doctor. He said shortly after this, P.C. Tulloch handed him a blood-stained axe that he had found on the floor downstairs. Robert Marr was then arrested for the ill use of his child and taken to the police station, and P.C. Spindler said after the child's death he was then charged with the willful murder of Robert Jr. He said Robert Sr. told him, "I am sorry for what I have done. I am sorry for the kiddie, but I could not say how we could exist, the three of us. That is all I have to say. I am sorry for my wife, and if I had done what was right, it would have been the three of us," meaning that they all would have been killed. PC Dixon said he had been alerted to the house by the sounds of a woman screaming. He said when he arrived, which had been before the other police officers, Robert Sr. was at the open door. He said he made a lunge at him with the axe, and because he backed away, he said Robert Sr. was then able to close the door and lock it. He said he had then gone to seek help to get into the house. PC Dixon added that he already knew Robert Sr. He had arrested him last month when he had been found in the Newquay area in the early hours and had not been able to explain why he was there. On that night, he had been searched, and in his possession were a watch and chain, 2 purses and some money in gold and silver. It had been suspected that he had stolen these items, but the charges were later withdrawn, although he did not actually say why this had happened. He added that the magistrates at the hearing had then remanded him to the workhouse in North Shields for 14 days on account of him having been found wandering in an unsound state of mind, and he said that he believed that Robert Sr. had been released around a week ago. I must add here that PC Dixon never gave any evidence of having gone back to the house in Hudson Street on the morning of the crime, after the first initial time that he had gone there when he had gone to seek help. Dr. Phillips of North Shields said he had been called to the house on the morning of the 13th. He had seen Robert Jr. and knew there would be little he could do for him. He had a very serious wound to his head, and he died a little over an hour and a half later. He said he had also performed the post-mortem on the body of Robert Marr Jr., and it was his professional opinion that the little boy had died due to the fracture to the skull and blood loss from the wound to his head. No further evidence was called for, and the coroner spoke to the jury, stating that it was not for them to decide what the state of mind of the prisoner was at the time the crime was committed. That was for a higher court to decide. It was only for them to decide whether they felt that Robert Sr. had caused the death of his son. The jury retired for a short time before returning a verdict of guilty of wilful murder, and Robert Marr Sr. was committed for trial. It was said that throughout the inquest, Robert Sr. had sat in silence and appeared to be in a dazed condition. I did not find any details of a funeral for Robert Marr Jr. Sadly, it does seem that the family did not have very much money, so it is most likely that this would have been a pauper's funeral. Based on the area where they lived, it is also most likely that the funeral would have taken place at Preston Cemetery. I did not find any evidence of a headstone anywhere in the area for Robert Marr Jr. The trial took place at the Moot Hall in late June of 1911 before Mr. Justice Scruton. When asked how he pleaded to the charge, Robert Sr. replied, "I did not know what I was doing." To this, the judge responded, "That is a plea of not guilty." As is often the case, the evidence given at the trial is the same as that given at the inquest, so I will only include any new details. In this case, only 4 witnesses were recalled to give evidence. Jane Maxwell, PC Spindler and PC Dixon all gave the same details as they had previously. Dr. Phillips was then called and asked about the 16th of May, when Robert Sr. had been found wandering the streets of North Shields. He stated that he had examined Robert Sr. and he felt him to be depressed with a tendency towards homicidal mania, or that he may possibly try to take his own life. However, he felt he leaned more towards homicidal mania. He said at the time he had certified him as a wandering lunatic, and he had been sent to the workhouse infirmary because of this. He said on June the 13th, when he had been called to the house of the Marrs, he had seen the child Robert Marr Jr. He had some very serious injuries that had been caused by extreme violence, which to him had been caused by a maniac. He continued by saying that he had later examined Robert Sr. and had found him to be wild and strange in his manner, and speaking as an expert, he felt that he was just recovering from an attack of homicidal mania. Dr. Hardcastle, the surgeon at Newcastle Prison, said he had examined the prisoner and found him to be suffering from melancholia. I did not find any details of the summing up for either the prosecution or the judge, and Robert Marr did not give evidence on his own behalf. The defence stated that he did not dispute that Robert Marr Sr. had taken the life of his son, but he said the jury must decide if he had been in his right mind at the time he committed the crime, adding that the evidence of Dr. Phillips suggested that he had not been. He said it was known that Robert Marr loved his family and had shown them nothing but kindness before this awful deed had taken place, and he urged the jury to return a verdict of guilty but insane at the time. The jury, after retiring for a very short time, returned a verdict of guilty of murder, but that Robert Marr had been insane at the time and had not known what he was doing. The judge then sentenced Robert to penal servitude for life. Robert did not make any response to the sentence. Although I did not find any further details of Robert Marr after this date, we can assume that he would have been most likely sent to Broadmoor Criminal Lunatic Asylum. Sadly, I was unable to find any details as to what happened to Robert's wife after this date, but we have to hope that she did go on to have a better life. This was an incredibly tragic case. There seems to be no known reason for Robert Marr's sudden change of behaviour on his return from London, and although it is mentioned that he complained of pains and noises in his head, no evidence was given to suggest that he had been involved in any accidents to cause this, or that he had had any illnesses that may have also caused it. He himself suggested that he had planned to take the lives of both his wife and his child and then his own. However, there seems to be no reason why he felt this was the only thing that he could do. The family were not well off, but there was no suggestion that they would be homeless or require the help of the workhouse. It really does seem to be a case of a sudden attack of homicidal mania, but what caused this is unknown. And when I first began to research into this story, I had been somewhat alarmed to find that Mrs. Marr and Jane Maxwell had both escaped, but seemed to have left the child behind unprotected. But after hearing the evidence, it seems that Mrs. Marr never intended to leave Robert Jr. behind, but in her panic to get out of the window, had fallen and had not been able to bring him with her. Was this the truth? Well, that is something we will never know for sure, but it must have been an awful guilt for her to live with for the rest of her life. Were the jury right to find Robert Marr Sr. insane at the time of the crime? Well, I have to say, based on the evidence and the earlier issue in May, I think they probably were. He does seem to have been suffering from some serious problems, and I do not think that they could really have come to any other verdict. My only hope is that, unlike another recent story, he was not released a few years later, as I don't feel that he would have ever been safe to wander the streets without the chance of him killing again. But whatever his state of mind, this was still a very tragic end for a poor child who still had all of his life ahead of him. But what do you think? Do you think Robert Sr. was insane at the time he committed the crime? Do you think the jury came to the correct verdict, or do you think he should have been found guilty of murder and hanged for his crime? And do you think that Mrs. Marr really did intend to save her son, or do you think the story of her falling was a lie to cover her guilt at leaving him behind? Do please let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this a very sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.